session methods that make the state transitions happen in Hibernate. Here you can see session methods that make state transitions happen. An entity instance in our application appears in one of three main states in relation to the session persistence context. Transient. This transient isn't and never was attached to a session. This instance has no corresponding rows in the database. It's usually just a new object that we created to save to the database. Persistent. This instance is associated with a unique session object. Upon flushing the session to the database, this entity is guaranteed to have corresponding consistent record in the database. Detached. This instance was once attached to a session. In a persistent state, but now it's not. An instance entered this state if we evict it from context, clear or close the session, or put the instance through serialization, deserialization process. When the entity instance is in the persistent state, all the changes that we make to the mapped fields of this instance will be applied to the corresponding database records and fields upon flushing session. The persistent instance is online, whereas the detached instance is offline and not monitored for changes. This means that when we change the fields of a persistent object, we don't have to call save, update or any of those methods to get these changes to the database. All we need to do is commit the transaction, flush the transaction or close the session. Persist. The persist method is intended to add a new entity instant to the persistent context. That is transitioning an instance from transient to persistent state. Save. The save method is an original Hibernate method that doesn't conform to the JPA specification. Its purpose is basically the same as persist, but it has different implementation details. The documentation for this method strictly states that it persists the instant, first assigning a generated identifier the method will return serializable value of this identifier. Merge. The main intention of the merge method is to update a persistent entity instance with new field values from the detached entity instance. For instance, suppose we have RESTful interface with the method of retrieving a JSON serialized object by its ID to the caller, and the method that receives an update version of this object from the caller. An entity that passed through such serialization deserialization will appear in a detached state. After deserializing this entity instance, we need to get a persistent entity instance from a persistent context and update its field with new values from this detached instance. So the merge method does exactly that. Find an entity instance by ID taken from past object. Either an existing entity instance from the persistent context is retrieved, or a new instance loaded from database. Copies fields from the past object to the instance, returns a newly updated instance. Update, as with persist and save, it's the update method is an original Hibernate method. Its semantics differ in several key points. It acts upon a past object. Its return type is void. The update method transitions the past object from detached to persistent state. This method throws an exception if the pass is in if we pass it a transient entity. Save or update. This method appears only in Hibernate API and doesn't have its standardized counterpart similar to update. We can also use it for reattaching instances. Actually, the internal default update event listener class that processes the update method is a class of default save or update listener, just overriding some functionality. The main difference of the save or update method is that it doesn't throw an exception when we applied to a transition instance. Instead, it makes it transient instance persistent. Here you can see a new is passed to transient, and transient interacts with persistent. Save persistent. Save persist. Save updates are from transient to persistent. Delete is from persistent to transient. Persistent object is inside in the session. Persistent interacts with detach, evict, and session.close are passed from persistent to detach. Locked, update, merge, and save or update are passed from detach to persistent. Get, load, and SQL query are to persistent. We can now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.